In this video, we're going to be looking a little bit further in the concept of an ecosystem. So in another video, we've looked at the structure of an ecosystem and how the organisms interact. In this one, we're going to start with looking at predation in particular, about the predator and prey relationships, before moving on to two particular cycles of the ecosystem, which is the water cycle and the carbon cycle. Then finally, if you're doing separate biology, then you need to know a little bit more about decomposition or decay. So let's start with the predator and prey relationship here. So first of all, this red line is representing the predator population. So you can see that it will fluctuate throughout time. But what's causing that fluctuation? So you can see here, as the predator population starts to decrease, this usually means that there's less food available in that sense, which means less prey is available. However, because there's less predator, that means more prey is allowed to survive and they will reproduce, increasing the population number. As it gets to a high number, that means there's more food available now for the predators to hunt and eat. So the more prey starts to be killed as the predator population increases. And that carries on until, again, same thing, as it reaches the predator's peak population, they start to decrease because there's not enough food available for them anymore, so the prey population starts to increase again, and basically the cycle continues as time goes on. The key concepts would be about food availability and the ability to survive and reproduce. So the food availability concept is mainly for the predator population because it's about how much prey or how much food or energy is available. But for both of them, the same concept of survive and reproduce applies. So it's similar to, this phrase you've come across many times before, especially when it comes to natural selection. But the idea is that if you got more food, then you can survive and reproduce, or if you're not being killed as much, then again, it means you're surviving more and reproducing more. So that would lead to an increase in the population to regenerate. So this is a classic example of interdependence, about how different populations would rely on one another to survive. It's going to be a problem if one population completely dies out, because that will have a knock-on effect on other populations as well. So that is the predator and prey relationship. Next, we're going to look at the water cycle. So we can use this diagram to kind of illustrate the water cycle. Types of questions that you might get asked would be maybe they give you a similar picture and then ask you to label some of the processes that we can see in the water cycle. Or perhaps they might give you a picture like this and ask you to use the diagram to explain or describe how water is recycled in an ecosystem. So first of all, we know that the water can exist as a liquid form in living things and in the oceans, but it can also form water vapor in the air. So the first process is how that the water from the oceans or the lakes can be evaporated, turning into water vapor. This could be due to the heat from the ground or the heat from the sun. Next thing is that all of the plants that we have can also let water vapor escape from the surface, and this is called transpiration. So you might remember coming across this one a couple of chapters ago, which means it is the loss of water vapor by evaporation through the stomata. So that is transpiration. And both of these basically releases water vapor as a gas, and it goes up into the atmosphere. Now, for the water vapor, eventually, because it's in the air, which can be quite cold, condensation can then occur, turning the water vapor back into water droplets, for example, in the clouds. And eventually, when there's enough of it, then the water vapor or the water droplets rains down back onto the planet. So this is called precipitation, which is just a fancy name for raining. So water comes back down onto the planet, onto the Earth. And once it reaches the land, there are lots of cracks in the rocks and soil. So for example, they would kind of flow inwards into the land like this, and then they could either be taken up by the plants again, because plants have roots, so they can absorb the water in the soil, or they might just run back into the ocean as well. So this process is called percolation, where the water is running through the gaps in the rocks and soil and through the earth itself. And that you can see how it goes back into plants or back into the oceans and rivers where the water was first lost. So this is the water cycle. Make sure you remember what the keywords are and what they mean when it comes to exam questions. So now we're going to have a look at the carbon cycle. There are actually a few more exam questions on the carbon cycle, which again can come up in different forms. It could be a picture, and they will ask you to label some of the missing labels using about particularly how the actual carbon is recycled. It could also be a 6-mark question. It's actually quite a common 6-mark question where they would ask you to describe the carbon cycle as shown in the diagram that they give you in the question. So make sure you just use that picture there. A few things though that students tend to do in the exams is that students are really, really good at naming the actual processes within the carbon cycle. However, the exam questions will actually require you to not just name the actual step, they would also want you to actually state clearly what the carbon is stored at the different points in time. So I'll explain a little bit more as we go through this particular process. So first of all, here in, let's say an ecosystem, we've got plants, which are producers, we've got animals, and obviously humans are in the environment as well, so we need to keep that into consideration. So first of all, with the plant, because plants can do photosynthesis and they can be eaten by the animals. So in that case, we say that this process of feeding is one way to transfer the carbon. In the plant, the carbon might be stored as starch. They can be stored as cellulose. They can be stored as proteins and lipids as well, because these are all made up of carbon. So all of the stuff that they have used the carbon to make, when they're eaten by the animal, they get transferred. And obviously the animal will then eat it and digest the food and then turning it into their own carbon stores. So for example, it would be, instead of starch, we can have glycogen, we can have again proteins and lipids as well. And one thing that I probably should remember as well to mention is obviously this is their glucose store, right? So the whole point is that the glucose has been turned into some of these structures here, which allows them to, which will be made up of carbon. The animal can then eventually die. Again, there is not particular transfer, but the concept of death, after death, there's decay into or decomposition, which can then allow them over millions of years to form fossil fuels, which again is the carbon store. And these fossil fuels can be extracted by humans, and the fossil fuels will then be burnt in the factories, for example, or the power stations, and they would release carbon dioxide into the air. And this process is called combustion or burning. And carbon dioxide is probably one of the major things that we talk about in the carbon cycle because we got so much of it in the atmosphere. Now, we haven't quite seen a cycle yet, so how does the carbon dioxide get back into the living things is with the plants. So plants can actually take in the carbon dioxide by photosynthesis. Or to rephrase it better is the fact that the plants are taking in the carbon dioxide in order to do photosynthesis. And that is the process where they convert the carbon dioxide into glucose inside the plant, which can then be converted into the list you can see underneath the tree there: starch, cellulose, proteins, and lipids. But at the same time, the plants themselves, along with any other living animals, living organisms, all of them do one particular process, which is called respiration. And respiration is where you break down the glucose for energy, and in that process you would release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And yes, the plants can actually use some of the CO2 they made from respiration for photosynthesis, but otherwise they would be releasing it, or they can release it to the atmosphere along with all of the other animals. And actually, for the process of decay and decomposition, apart from some of them being able to turn into fossil fuels, actually a lot of times the bacteria that is found on the surface of the decaying organism would be releasing carbon dioxide as part of their aerobic respiration. So keep in mind that there will be some bacteria which acts as decomposers, can break down the organisms or the dead or decaying matter, and that releases CO2. So remember, finally, just to summarize, make sure that when you're describing the carbon cycle, you're able to actually name the processes, which is what, as you can see in all the purple bits here. Make sure you mention the carbon store as well. So is it a glucose, is it glycogen, starch, etc. Most of the time, you only need to name one store if it's within the living organisms, and that will be enough. Finally, one thing that you might also want to mention, especially in a 6-marker question, is the direction where the carbon is transferred. So you want to say that carbon in the plant stored as starch is transferred to the animal through feeding, and the animal is then going to convert that carbon into glycogen, for example. So it's from the plants to the animals, or from the ground of where the fossil fuels are to the factories, or from the animal to the atmosphere. You want to mention the actual direction where the carbon is transferring. So that's the carbon cycle. So if you're doing the combined biology course, then this is what you need to know, which is the predator-prey relationship. Make sure you're able to describe how the predator and prey populations might interact and why they will fluctuate. Then for the 2 cycles, the point is that we've got limited water and carbon in the atmosphere, so we're not making necessarily more water or carbon, we're just simply recycling them, and be able to describe exactly how they might be recycled through the different processes, and where possible, name the actual store, for example, carbon store in the actual place in the ecosystem. Now, if you're doing separate biology, then carry on watching this video. We'll just summarize a little bit on decomposition. So decomposition is also known as decay. The 2 words can be used interchangeably. So the key thing we're going to look at is that what are some of the factors that are needed in order for decomposition or decay to occur. First of all, it will be the oxygen availability. So oxygen is needed for bacteria, which is the decomposers, to actually perform this reaction. So if there's not enough oxygen, then the bacteria won't be able to break down the material, which is essentially the bacteria's aerobic respiration. So without oxygen, decay can't happen. Secondly, it would be temperature. So again, similar concept is that the bacteria would need enzymes in order to do respiration or decay. If it's too cold, the enzymes will not be moving around, therefore they cannot collide with the substrate to decay them. And if it's too hot, then enzymes denature, again, cannot actually react. Water availability is another key concept there. Without water, then the bacteria or the enzymes can't move around, and therefore they can't actually do the decay. The pH level is important as well. Similar to the temperature concept, the pH will affect the enzyme action. Again, the wrong pH means enzymes denature, then the reaction cannot occur. The surface area is also really important, and as you can imagine, the larger the surface area, the faster the decay can happen, because there's more area for the bacteria to work on. So obviously the last one will be the existence of the bacteria. If an environment doesn't have bacteria, then decomposition won't occur, because the bacteria is the living thing that actually performs the decay process. So for separate biology, you are expected to, there is a required practical on the rate of decay. So they could ask it in different ways. A typical one in the practical is looking at the decay of lipids in milk. So the decay of milk, and how we can look at the fact that the fatty acids are produced when the milk is broken down. So we can look at how quickly the mixture turns acidic, looking at the pH indicators, etc. And then basically calculate the rate of decay by looking at how quickly the fatty acids are produced. So make sure you study up on that required practical. Another topic that might link to this will be the formation of fossils. So some of the fossils that we have as evidence for evolution, for example, the baby mammoth is not decayed. We got full baby mammoth because it was frozen in ice. So the temperature was not ideal. So therefore, the decay didn't happen. So keep in mind that some fossils are formed due to the lack of decay or lack of decomposition. So that's the summary of the entire topic of organizing an ecosystem.